culminating in a brutal war, spanning the last 2 decades of the 20th century.
This was a war, and these were soldiers, troops on the battlefield. That's how they behaved, as if they were at war, and they would take no prisoners.
These gang wars would create a climate of fear and leave hundreds dead or injured.
I was turned out to 8 murders on one Sunday, which the CID were actively investigating.
And spawned a generation who lived and died by the gun.
They were psychotic, some of them.
Manchester's gang wars would make headlines around the world, blight the reputation of one of Europe's most historic cities, and give birth to a new and sinister nickname, Manchester. This is the inside story of Manchester's ganglands. Manchester's earliest gangs, like the city itself, were forged in Britain's Industrial Revolution. By the 19th century, the cotton trade was operating on a vast industrial scale. The city, over 300 kilometres north of London, became Cottonopolis, the most important textile trading centre in the world. But not everyone benefited from these boom times.
You had very wealthy manufacturing barons and an extremely wealthy sort of city centre with top quality stores and impressive public buildings. This was surrounded really by a sea of squalor and very poor housing.
In the 1870s, chronic overcrowding and poverty helped foster a culture of street fighting gangs known as scuttlers. These were the hoodies of the day, with colourful names like the Bengal Tigers and Buffalo Bill's Gang. The city's fortunes dwindled in the Great Depression, industry slipped into terminal decline, unemployment rocketed. People did whatever they could to survive.
No money, no food, and robbing was the only way round, getting a few quid.
Out of these hard times emerged Jimmy Donnelly, known as the Weed because it was said he grew on you. He spent his early years on the south side of the city. His mean streets were those of Wythenshawe, the largest housing estate in Europe. He would grow up to become a member of one of Manchester's most infamous mobs, the Quality Street Gang. Crime lords of the city for almost 30 years. We'd learned his trade in 1950, at the tender age of 10, when post-war rationing meant sweets were still a luxury item.
I robbed a place called Brooks's Biscuits, and I went through the roof and rolled boxes and boxes of black chocolate off the roof, trying to run a few quid, selling it at school. I put the whole school in hospital. They all had the runs.
Jimmy then turned his hand from chocolate to meat and fish, when he started work as a delivery boy in the city's largest market, Smithfield. He was 15 and earning a wage, but already set on a career in crime.
You go into the kitchen, you throw your stuff down at the water, the chef would weigh it, or check it, but you didn't pinch that stuff. On your way out, you pinched a turkey that was delivered the day before. Here is the wholesale fish market, and which had 5 gates where all the wholesalers used to sell the fish. I actually worked across the road there in the retail market. The 3 gates was there, and my great friend Jimmy Stores worked in there.
At Smithfield, he found a fighting partner, delivery boy by day, street fighter by night. Jimmy Swords.
I'll get to know Jimmy. There was the odd occasion where I had a little pop at him, and I'd come unstuck. So I did try my hand with him, but he just flattened me.
This was the era of teddy boys, gang gangs of sharp-suited youths who fought with bike chains and cutthroat razors. The two Jimmies ran with a gang known as the Market Boys, who were carving out a reputation as tough guys. By day, they fiddled the market. By night, they took the city's clubs and bars by storm.
I was always tooled with a knife or an axe or an hammer. And they get a whack of that first.
But one fight at a local club proved particularly violent and landed him in trouble.
We didn't want to queue up because we're the boys, aren't we? Straight to the front of the queue, and the doorman objected, and bang, the doorman got a whack. The fellow had his nose bit off.
Jimmy claims he wasn't the nose biter, but his involvement in the fight led to a conviction for wounding and common assault. It led to his first stretch in jail, but he was free in less than a year.
So the reputation was going up and up and up and up. We really did some damage. Really did, them days.
With the reputation came a new moniker, the Quality Street Gang, or QSG, named after a chocolates advert of the time that featured comedy villains. They were a close-knit crew, many from the deprived Dancoats area of inner city Manchester. They were rarely photographed together, but during a trip to celebrate a shared love of boxing, they were captured on film at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Jimmy the Weed is in his trademark shades. The identity of his associates is such a closely guarded secret that they can't be named, even today. Hard on the heels of post-war austerity came the boom years of the swinging 60s. As the money rolled in and skirts rolled up, the lads began to rise through the ranks of the Manchester underworld. In 1961, the government legalised betting shops in an attempt to take gambling off the streets. Ironically, it led to an explosion in the number of casinos. Manchester became an entertainment capital, its vibrant club scene full of roulette wheels and gambling tables. Over 300 kilometres south, London's notorious Cray twins smelt the money. The Crays ran protection rackets, using intimidation and violence to squeeze money out of pub and club owners. And in 1966, they were eyeing up Manchester. Not only were the clubs alarmed, but the local crims were on edge too.
Really, it was a bit of a worry for the club owners.
There was a lot of clubs in Manchester at the time, and they were basically well behaved. The doorman looked after them pretty well. What we didn't want to happen, of course, was people like the Cray twins coming rustling in and working the protection racket, which clearly was what they were after.
Fearing the worst, club owners hedged their bets, tipping off both the cops and the local villains.
We'd received information that the Cray twins had come to Manchester the day before, and at that present time we were ensconced in the Midland Hotel.
There's plenty of people, young people, willing to make a better name out of your name, who was on standby to make sure if there was any problems that they did get sent off.
Manchester's underworld was determined no one, not even the mighty Crays, was going to muscle in on their patch. The Crays targeted the popular Portland Club, and the doorman was beaten up. The police moved quickly and confronted the twins at their hotel.
We had the riot act, which briefly said, "This is Manchester, you're undesirables, you're not welcome here, get out."
And they've never taken out Manchester anyway. They wouldn't have gone back to London, put it that way. They'd have never got back. Well, they wouldn't have got back in that. They would have spent money on a coffin. Maybe a spade.
An unlikely combination of cops and criminals had scuppered any chance the Crays had of making an assault on the Manchester underworld. Instead, the Crays returned to London, where they would wreak havoc for the next 2 years. The 1970s had arrived. Fashion went flared, and Manchester danced its own version of Tamla Motown, rather than and sold. Jimmy now had a wife and kids, while his other family, the QSG, had become faces of the city, men you didn't mess with. They had moved into boxing, property, and the car trade. Jimmy bought nightclubs in a scrapyard where he handled the occasional stolen car part. Violence was a way of life.
Lots and lots and lots of things happened here. A few people was carried in here and carried out. And notably one man who threatened me and asked me for £2,000. We threw him in one of the cars and put the crane round and dropped the weights on it. And swashed it within about an inch of him. Dragging him out, he never came back and he never asked me £2 again.
The QSG were a tight bunch. Secrecy and the threat of reprisals for loose talk hampered all efforts to bring its members to court. Police investigations were not helped by allegations of corruption within their own ranks.
There's no doubt at all that the Quality Street Gang, like other groups of that era in other cities, were receiving tip-offs from the police or from certain corrupt police officers.
Allegations of corruption went as high as Manchester's Deputy Chief Constable, John Stalker, who was accused of having links to the QSG. Stalker cleared his name and was fully exonerated of any misconduct. While it's undeniable that the QSG received the occasional police tip-off, Jimmy denies they ever had a top cop on the payroll.
No policemen on the firm. We did get snippets of different things and what have you. Naturally, everybody does. But no way did anybody have anything to do with John Stalker in the QSG. Nobody.
But for the QSG, the Stalker investigation had placed an unwanted spotlight on their activities. From now on, they took more of a back seat.
Well, they certainly were very crafty and cunning. They realised that getting into trouble with the police was not the way forward. It was better for other people to do their dirty work for them. They were really criminal managers.
But Jimmy was still on the front line.
I mean, you'd have to get your hands dirty. If you've got £1 million worth of gold, it's got to come to you eventually, hasn't it? I mean, what's the point of being there? So, you might set it up, you might direct operations, and at the end of the day, you'd get your whack or you'd get the lot of it, and then you'd pay whatever.
Handling stolen goods proved to be lucrative for Jimmy, and he didn't care who he sold them to. In the mid-1980s, Britain was still embroiled in a bloody civil war between Northern Ireland's nationalist and unionist communities. When stolen guns came his way, the Weed had no qualms about selling them onto the paramilitaries.
It was money. If there's a parcel and something to buy it, it was bought and sold. And that was it.
In Manchester, the QSG took on an almost mythical status that survives to this day. For the cops, getting charges to stick against the QSG proved almost impossible, and no serious prosecutions were ever brought against them. (1979) arrived with a new Conservative government, rising inflation and high unemployment. But in Manchester, the villains bucked the trend with a new money-making enterprise, armed robbery. Wages were still delivered by hand, soft targets for hard men. And professional robbers Fred Scott and Lenny Pilot took full advantage.
We knew them very well, and they were good workers. I mean, the way they performed the work was fabulous.
At the time, they would have been regarded as the most prolific and successful armed robbers in the north of England.
Scott and Pilot formed the Crazy Face Gang, named for the grotesque masks they wore to terrify their victims. They targeted cash deliveries, mostly from security vans.
In them days, there's a lot of ready cash around, and that's what we wanted.
crime syndicate of robbers and developed a network of tip-offs. This former gang member served time and claims to have put his past behind him, so he prefers to remain anonymous. He reveals how the gang operated.
At any one time, we might have 10, 15, 20 bits of work, in mind, and eventually we'd settle on one.
From the late 70s to the early 80s, he claims they hit about 20 targets. These guys were all about speed. Hit a job fast, take the money within 90 seconds, or leave empty-handed. Kenny Corner was a career robber and a prolific one.
He got me 285,000 quid in cash at Stroll, not to mention the jewellery, paintings, antiques and whatever else we stole. You know what I mean? But I was mainly cash.
He met the Crazy Face gang in prison and was tempted by their invitation to join them, but was wary of their use of guns.
Nick concocted all this up then. Let's go out and do some armed robberies. Armed robberies? No, not for me, mate. Not my scene armed robberies. I don't need a gun. There's my gun. I can rob money without guns.
In May 1982, the gang got a tip-off about the weekly wages run from a local bank to the Failsworth Hat Company.
It was difficult. You couldn't take the money from the bank. The bank was on the main road on a sort of humpback bridge. It was difficult, very, very difficult.
This gang were pros, renowned for their level of planning before a job. First they drilled holes in the back of a van, then parked up across the street from the bank. From their hiding place inside, they watched how the money was moved from the bank to the nearby factory at the end of a cul-de-sac.
We knew then what time the money was picked up. It was actually chained to the man's hand when he left the bank, but unchained when he put it in the boot of his car. We couldn't touch it near the bank, we couldn't go near it. So we decided the best place to take it is just before they actually get to the company, as the end is cul-de-sac.
Assured of success, Kenny Connor agreed to join the team.
Well, they'd done their own work on it, and they'd done their own work, see what happens there with that company. And the reason he wanted to do that is, like I said, it was simple.
On Friday, June the 4th, the Hat Company wages were collected as usual. But this time, the Crazy Face gang, kitted up with masks and shotguns, was lying in wait.
Pilot and Scott are in this street in the van. Alright? As the fails of fat blokes come, they turn in the street here. Pilot and Scott start up, tear around this corner, smack into them, bang.
Scott and Pilot rammed the car containing the money.
Scott gets out this side with one gun. He's got them. Pilot gets out this side, runs to the stand, he gets hold of him.
With the driver dazed, the gang grabbed the cash.
Go to the boot, get the case, take it out, down the bin, into the getaway car, and we're off.
The men made their escape £7,000 richer, a pattern they would repeat time and again.
Easy, very easy. No problems at all with that.
Though Connor got his share of the money, the use of shotguns in the robbery had unnerved him.
It must have been terrifying for him, you know what I mean? I thought, right, that's the last time I do this for anyone. Don't like it.
Connor claims it was his last job with them, but the gang had enjoyed the sweet taste of success, and they wanted more. By the end of the year, they were so prolific, robberies rose by over a third across the county, and the use of guns quadrupled from the 79 average to 6 a week, as other robbers followed their lead. But by 1983, they were doing so many jobs, it was inevitable their success couldn't last much longer. Thursday, March the 24th, was another wages delivery, this time to the Walls Meat Factory. Up to £100,000 was for the taking from a security van, or so the gang had hoped. Pilot and two of the gang gang members took up position in the factory's goods yard. Gang leader Fred Scott donned a disguise and wandered into the factory's reception. When the security guards arrived with their money bags, Scott whipped out a gun, and all hell broke loose.
Scott drew the gun, so these two guards on the floor, there was uproar going on inside the offices, there's people outside running and screaming and shouting, and the money was inside the van.
The guards had only brought out the first money bags. The rest was still in the van, with a security guard. In their frustration, the gang fired into the van. The cash chute remained closed.
The guard inside the van was that terrified, he just wouldn't open from the inside. And it's just one of those things, it was a very difficult one to organise, and it didn't happen. Just timing wasn't right, something was wrong, and we just didn't get the money.
Scott had grabbed £10,000 in the factory, but the security guard had scuppered their plans to snatch the £100,000 target. By now the police were frustrated by the volume of the gang's jobs and their brazen use of firearms. Manchester's chief constable demanded they be taken off the streets.
We've got armed response units in the town, in the city. We've got wanted posters up all over offering rewards, which was a concern of ours. One thing, nobody's saying nothing, you know, somebody that's just on the outskirts, on the fringes of the gang. But of course, people out on the fringes could be tempted by, you know, in them days, a 20, 30,000, 40,000 reward in them days could easily have been costly for us.
But in the end, it wasn't a grass who would finally call time on the crazy-faced gang. The gang robbed a post office in Moston, north of the city. They escaped with £6,000 in a stolen car, but as they switched to their own cars, they were spotted. The registration numbers led police straight to Scott and Pilot.
That was the start. That's how the police was on from there.
Scott and Pilot were charged with the robbery, and now events took a dramatic turn for the pair. In the 1970s, London's Metropolitan Police had pioneered the use of supergrasses to target armed robbery gangs.
There hadn't really been an equivalent in Manchester because Manchester hadn't had the same problem at that time with armed robbery, but in the 70s it developed.
Then the crazy-faced gang came along. Now an ambitious young officer, Henry Exton, put a plan into action, even more devious than the robbers. Before the trial, Exton made contact with Pilot, and the two met in a pub.
I think Pilot was just jogging him along to see if he could learn something. That's all. Nothing else.
Unknown to Pilot, the meeting was secretly recorded. Months later, Scott and Pilot were sentenced to 10 years for the post office job. But police still had to prove they did the other jobs too. Exton played his next card. He visited Pilot in Manchester's Strangeways jail, and this time asked Pilot to turn supergrass and confess to all the gang's crimes.
There was never any chance in the world, and any Pilot was ever going to talk to the police. Never. And the same with Fred Scott. Fred Scott didn't even talk to himself, and never talked to anybody else. You couldn't get near Fred Scott. So no, there was no chance. No chance. You had to be something very, very clever, very good to get them two to talk.
With Pilot refusing to cooperate, Exton needed Scott to talk. He produced the secret recording.
Exton offered him the deal and played him a tape, and Pilot's voice was on the tape. Scott, he was prepared to believe that his partner in crime was talking behind his back to the police, which was enough for him to do a deal with Exton. It was all a very, very clever
Suspecting his partner had already coughed the cops, Scott named the whole gang and confessed to the robberies. He gave precise details of where they disposed of the shotguns and the locations of safe houses used to hide the stolen cash.
It was almost unprecedented in this area. At that stage, nobody of that rank, if you like, really, in terms of criminality, had turned state's evidence and gone against his colleagues.
In dawn raids across the northwest, police rounded up the gang. Manchester's underworld was turned upside down.
He felt horrible to feel like a man like Fred, you know, real stand-up, staunch man. Had done this. It was unheard of at the time in Manchester. Nobody heard of the word supergrass. Nobody knew what it meant.
Other gang members followed Scott's lead and named Pilot. Facing a minimum of 20 years in jail, Pilot too turned supergrass. He was given 6.5 years for his crimes. 9 gang members were jailed for a total of 55 years. Kenny Connor got 10 years.
No feelings whatsoever. You take it with a pinch of salt. What goes around comes around. I'm a criminal, accepts everything. And if they're going to catch me, use any method.
Rumours circulated in the press of a £50,000 QSG contract to kill Scott and Pilot.
I don't think there's any truth in it, no. Never mind the 50 grand. If somebody had found Scott and Pilot, they'd have done it for nothing and put them away.
A whole tier of Manchester gangsters had been taken out. But instead of cleaning up the city streets, it only ushered in a new generation of dangerous young hoods.
A new, younger breed, who the police knew nothing about, suddenly emerged and took their place. That really was the start of the modern gang of the 1980s.
They were just, ruthless criminals who had a laissez-faire attitude to the law and the police, and they operated in an open way and didn't care if they got arrested.
The new wave rose from the ashes of several nights of riots that hit the streets of London, Liverpool and Manchester in 1981. Years of harassment, interracial unrest, and soaring unemployment in Britain's black communities culminated in pitched battles with police. In the Manchester suburb of Moss Side, 1,000 youths besieged the local police station, triggering 2 days of burning and looting.
It was absolutely intimidating to see such devastation and crime occurring as a young officer. Buildings being burned down, the devastation, people attacking your police officers with dustbin lids as riot shields, police officers bandaged.
The story of Manchester's underworld took a new and deadly turn. It was about hard drugs, big money, and a brutal battle for control. Even today, the fear of reprisals is so great, gang members past and present won't talk. This is a story only the cops are willing to tell. Moss Side had all the necessary ingredients for violence to take root and flourish. Less than 2 square kilometres and with 9,000 residents, by 1981, unemployment in the area stood at 30%, 3 times the national average. Jobs for black youths were hard to come by. Moss Side was ripe for an American-style gang culture. Lack of opportunities caused its disillusioned youth to look for ways to make money. Moss Side was fertile ground for an explosion in drug use.
In the 60s and 70s, cannabis was the main drug problem. As the years rolled by, things progressed, the drug scene changed somewhat.
A new drug had arrived, heroin.
It began to be an issue really from the early 80s onwards. A lot of it because of the development of the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan-Pakistan border as a major source of heroin. And this started to seep into the UK market, and the main market in the north of England became a particular area of Moss Side where heroin could be bought on the street.
Illegal drugs became Britain's prohibition, creating a climate where violence and gangs could flourish. Cheetham Hill lies on the north side of the city. The Waterloo estate was home to a gang of serious criminals known as the Cheetham Hillbillies. Many of their families moved here during the slum clearances of Moss Side in the late 1960s. A generation grew up with friends and enemies living in both communities. Feuds started over women, but quickly became about reputation. While Moss Side's notoriety came from drugs, the Hillbillies spent the 80s carving out a name for violence, especially armed robbery.
Cheetham Hill was slightly different than Moss Side, in as much as, one, they were sort of identified as a group or a gang. They were specialising in robberies, building societies and post offices, in other words, stealing money.
Franklin Sinclair got the measure of the Hillbillies, to representing many of them in court.
Cheetham Hill were talk of the town, as it were. Some of them were simply violent, some of them were very streetwise, some of them were ruthless, some of them were calculating, most of them were professional.
It was only a matter of time before the Hillbillies tried to muscle in on Moss Side.
Eventually they decided that there was also money to be made in the drugs business, and they branched out into that as well. And I think that's what resulted in quite a lot of conflict between the two elements.
Moving up the hierarchy of the Hillbillies was 19-year-old Anthony Johnson. One of the few white gang members, he was known as White Tony.
White Tony really epitomised this new breed of wild, reckless young gangster who would stop at nothing, scared of nobody. No crime was too audacious or out of bounds for him, and he soon attracted almost cult status in Manchester in the criminal underworld.
White Tony was about to prove himself. Father of two, Anthony Gardner, had recently moved to Moss Side. His Christian parents knew little of his new life.
He get into trouble with his friends. He follow, as you know, young people mostly follow their friends, and that's what he do. And he get in some little trouble, but not great big trouble.
It's believed he'd fallen out with the hillbilly leader over money, and for Gardner, that meant big trouble. On Sunday, January the 10th, Gardner had spent the day at church with his children and parents.
When it was 6 o'clock, we get ready to go back to church. And Tony said he wasn't going back that night. And he said, "Goodbye, Mommy, goodbye, Daddy." And then he left. And that's the last we have seen of Tony or hear from Tony. We have never seen him again.
He returned to Moss Side. Later that evening, as he sat in a friend's car, the gunman stepped out of the shadows and shot him dead.
He was very, very caring, and he loved his parents, and I don't know why they kill him, but it's a great loss in the family. My husband, he was crying for his son. The family have got great grief. His niece and them, they were only young, but some of them still remember.
No one was arrested for his murder, but Johnson bragged he'd pulled the trigger.
And this really, I think, proved it made Johnson's reputation to the gang, both who he worked for, but also to his rivals.
White Tony lived by the gun, and that's why he progressed as quickly as he did, because he was fearless.
As White Tony was establishing his reputation, Manchester was changing. July 1988, saw the birth of a cultural revolution in the city's club scene. US import acid house music had arrived, and with it, the potentially lethal dance drug, ecstasy. The city became Manchester. Not since the 1960s had the city been an entertainment capital. Now, clubbers rubbed shoulders with bands like the Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses. Recreational drug users flocked to the Hacienda nightclub, the mecca of dance music. While just 3 kilometers away, heroin addicts were making a pilgrimage of a different sort. Moss Side shopping precinct had become the Northwest's prime marketplace for heroin.
It was quite shocking to see because it was that blatant. You had people who came and stood on the street, and you reflect and think, how did this establish itself? Which came first, the dealers or the abusers?
Police launched a thorough crackdown. They'd learned lessons from before. First, they targeted the suppliers. In February, as the London train pulled into the city's Piccadilly station, the drug squad was lying in wait. In a neat sting, they arrested 2 men carrying over a kilo of heroin worth close to £250,000. In November, police hit the dealers. They used video evidence to prosecute 12 men and smash the lucrative heroin market centered around the shopping precinct. But other criminal elements quickly filled the void, and the heroin market moved deep into the neighbouring Alexandra Park estate. It was a critical turning point. The Moss Siders split into 2 distinct gangs, named after the streets where they lived. They carved up the estate between them.
Alexandra Road South into Alexandra Road up to Moss Lane West would be the dividing line. This side of the estate would be known as the Gooch Close Gang. This area here would be what was commonly known as the Doddington Gang territory.
The brutal gang and turf war began as the 2 sides battled to control the lucrative drugs trade. His former police officer patrolled the estate as hostilities began. The nature of his detective work means he has to remain anonymous.
They took it as an insult, as a slight, if competitors or people from another faction came onto their turf as such. They all had lucrative drug dealing activity within their particular areas, and they wouldn't allow anybody else to impact on their business because that's how they made their money. And they guarded and defended their area, their geographical area, sometimes with their lives. There's no doubt about that.
'91 was a bad year for gang-on-gang attacks, as the violence escalated. And for Hillbilly White Tony, it was the end of the line. Cheetham Hill, Friday, February the 22nd. White Tony was murdered outside this former pub in the heart of Hillbilly territory. Police believed he was taken out by his own side.
These people were jealous of him, jealous of his rise to prominence, and they were unhappy with his arrogant attitude and his cockiness, and the fact that he probably didn't give them any respect at all.
For Anthony Gardner's mother, his death was closure of sorts.
My feelings for him, when I heard that someone shot my son, I didn't have a grudge. I'm not a person that can carry a grudge. I'm Christian. And all I was praying is that they would catch him. But I didn't pray that nothing wrong happened to him.
Back in Moss Side, the Alexandra Park estate was fast becoming a war zone.
It basically became a series of tit-for-tat shootings or stabbing.
A 12-year-old boy was shot from a passing car in Gooch Close. Within 2 hours, the Gooch gang attacked a man with a machete in a local pub.
It's required of them to not be cowed in any way, and that they had to retaliate, and the sooner the better. And it wasn't not unusual to get a major job one day and next day find that somebody been shot in the leg, only to find out that next day somebody from the other opposing side had been also shot in the leg.
The Manchester label was forgotten as the city now gained international notoriety as Manchester.
You had this kind of arms race growing between these two small groups of people.
Not only was it difficult to find witnesses to these incidents, it was almost impossible to get the truth out of the victim. They're in fear of their lives. They know that if they go public, they are going to suffer reprisals.
By spring 1991, there had been 13 woundings and one attempted murder on the Alexandra Park estate alone. And hostilities now stepped up a gear. During the early hours of Monday, April the 29th, 17-year-old Carl Stapleton left his aunt's house and headed for his home in Gooch territory. He never made it. His body was later found slumped in an alleyway. He'd been mutilated with a machete. Stapleton simply lived on the wrong side of the estate.
It was a particularly savage murder that was undertaken on, quite a Sunday evening, whereby members of the Donington faction went over simply looking for somebody who was associated with the Gooch side.
The Gooch would now be out for revenge. Police moved quickly to take the gang off the streets and prevent further escalation in violence. They targeted the gang's heroin business, centred around an enclave off Gooch Close, at the heart of their territory.
The Gooch Close gang had established this particular drug marketplace in their area of the estate. They'd done that, again, to avoid law enforcement.
It was difficult to police because of the amounts of cul-de-sacs and dead ends. As you can see for yourself, there would be a lot of alleyways, a lot of walkways and so on and so forth around here.
We couldn't control access of abusers to buy drugs. We were losing control of people as they entered the walkways and then basically emerged elsewhere in the estate. It was extremely difficult to manage.
And there would be spotters and watchers and people affiliated with the gang. They would be everywhere looking for any police activity.
So we had to change our tactics.
The result was the landmark Operation China. Undercover officers posed as squatters and set up surveillance cameras inside a derelict flat overlooking the dealers. Over 5 weeks, key members of the Gooch were caught on camera dealing heroin to undercover officers. In a series of dramatic dawn raids, a whole generation of Moss Side dealers were arrested. 20 members of the Gooch were jailed for a total of 109 years. But the success was short-lived. For the Gooch who remained at large, there was still the death of Carl Stapleton to avenge. 3 Gooch members approached 19-year-old mechanic Darren Samuel on mountain bikes. They fired 10 shots, hitting the teenager in the head. Samuel Guy faced connection to the rival Doddington gang.
It was getting progressively worse, and that's something that did concern me, and that's something that I did talk about with colleagues as to where is this all going to end.
The first half of 1991 had seen 2 murders and countless shootings in Moss Side. The following year saw over 100 reports of gunfire during August and September alone. Saturday, January the 2nd, as 14-year-old Benji Stanley queued for food at a Moss Side takeaway, a gunman shot him in the chest at close range.
The round that was used on Stanley would be used for the destruction of animals such as bison. So could you imagine the devastation and the trauma that round must have caused that individual?
The schoolboy was an innocent bystander. The shockingly public execution was a case of mistaken identity.
Benji Stanley was a particularly horrific act by people who mistook an innocent young 14-year-old subside.
The gangs were on the brink of all-out war by 1994, and when a Cheetham Hill gang boss was shot at, everyone expected a bloodbath. But worn down by years of conflict, the gangs agreed instead to a truce. The worst days of the gang conflict seemed to be over, yet old hostilities don't just disappear.
The gangs resume their old ways. Initially, there's a civil war within one of the Mossad gangs itself, and then the others kind of join in. The old conflicts are renewed, and things get a lot worse.
Over the decades, Manchester's underworld has evolved, and so has its villains.
Well, I think there is a lesson. I think, if you say crime doesn't pay, most of the time it doesn't.
Jimmy is writing his memoirs, while his fellow gang members claim to have gone straight and invested in legitimate business ventures for the good of the city. Manchester too has reinvented itself and shaken off the Gunchester label. Gang-related shootings are down 82%. The Dollington gang is largely finished, and police have taken down the new generation of Gooch mobsters. But the city has yet to totally root out its ingrained gang culture. The saga of Manchester's ganglands may never end.